So we're here today with David, aka the 40-year-old vegan who was once a slaughterhouse worker and now turned avid animal rights activist. So, hello, David. Thank you so much for being here today. I was just wondering if you could just maybe give yourself a quick introduction, tell people about yourself just before we get into it.
Yeah, Al, thank you so much for having me on. And I just wanted to say, first off, I really appreciate all the work you and FTA have done over the years. You really built community and you really strive to help empower others. And all the work you do is really inspiring. So I just wanted to start off with that. So I'm David. And I'm a former slaughterhouse worker. I worked for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency for a number of years. And so now, since that, I've changed and seen the light, so to say. And now I'm an animal rights activist.
Can you explain the role that you actually had in the slaughterhouses? Because there's obviously, I think we think of the main one, but what specifically did you do in the slaughterhouse, and for how long for?
Yeah, so I worked in a variety of roles, so a number of them within the government of Canada for about 15 and a half years. So I put on many hats, different jobs, and I think the ones that are specific to this conversation are when I worked in a slaughterhouse and also when I worked in animal health. So my role was essentially that of, I guess you could say, a welfare. Uh, Sort of inspector. So I would go and as trucks were coming in, so I worked predominantly with chickens. They would come in and I would go inspect them to see what condition they were in. So, for example, if it was a hot day out, I would go monitor temperatures, or a cold day out, I would do that. And nothing would really trigger a further inspection for me unless if I saw, unfortunately, dead bodies on the truck. So there's a certain percentage that would require me to do a further inspection. And so that part entailed me going into the live receiving area and collecting a sample of birds. And so for anybody who's a little bit queasy or whatnot, uh, that job entailed me actually taking bodies into garbage bags and then bringing them into an area where a vet would perform an autopsy. They call it a necropsy, and I would have to monitor the vet. Cut open the birds. I would have to take pictures, take notes. It was really difficult part of the job, obviously, and so I would also monitor when the birds were being hung or the crates being put down. And so, very, I guess you could say, well forest kind of state. The other part of the job that I did much later at the end of my career was in a place called Animal Health. And so I would be required to take in those same inspection reports or non-compliance, as they called them. And my job was to review to make sure all the notes, all the pictures, all the video was there so they could decide whether or not these cases of abuse would go to court. And small story about that is when I first went into this place to work. I was told not to look at the videos or the footage because it was very traumatic, and people prior to that job had left due to stress leave because of that. And
Wow.
so those were a couple of the roles I did, as well as other types of roles, but to be more specific with the slaughter part here.
Yeah, you mentioned like welfarist. That was the word that you pointed out because I was going to ask like what you saw at these slaughterhouses, especially when you were an inspector. Would that be considered high welfare? And if so, what does that even look like?
Yeah. The word term welfare, so in a legal sense, I guess what the governments would state as considering high welfare would be the method in which these animals were brought up, transported, and eventually stunned and killed. So to me, it's very subjective. I don't know that there's such a thing as welfare that comes into this because if we're, captive bolt gunning a cow in the head, or we're electrocuting a chicken, or we're putting pigs into gas chambers, I don't see that as in their best interests.
Yeah.
So I think the term welfare is thrown around very willy nilly. I think it's more or less that, in a way for people to be able to kill these beings, it's to have them so they're immobilized to the point where they can, so that these animals aren't panicking, because that's what a natural being would do in these
Mhm.
situations. If you see a cow get shot, their instinct is to shake and move around. They're being hung up by a chain, and ultimately, their necks are being cut. They're panicking. All of them are. It's. I think it's more or less for the beings that are working on them, working,
Mhm.
to feel better about doing that, and uh, also a term that's used by industry quite a bit.
That's what's interesting. I've seen many a time people say that like the animals don't see it coming. They don't really care. They don't really react. Like so that's not been your experience when you worked in the slaughterhouses.
Yeah, of course not.
No.
You just walk into one of these places and the vibration just feels like it feels so low. The energy's low. It's almost like going to, I would say, a morgue. You feel just this energy that's down. People just don't seem content. It just seems like people are just mindlessly going to work, and yeah, of course, the animals can sense this.
Mhm.
I mean, you can smell the blood, you can smell the feces, you can smell it all, and the environment. It's really awful. That stuff permeates into your skin. All these things, and of course, yeah, they're well aware.
Well aware.
Their instincts are a lot. They're more in tune, I would say, with their instincts than we are as
Mhm.
humans. So.
Yeah, and you kind of touched upon the low energy, the low vibration of the people there. Like, did you notice personally a difference in your mental health, prior to when you started versus during that period of time? Did you notice that at all?
100%. Yeah, I completely went from like I started when I was pretty young. I was 20 when I started, and I was an athlete. I was working out all the time. I was very energetic and healthy. Some call me the life of the party. I'd always get invited to parties, but ever since I started working there, yeah, my complete persona changed. I would say. I think anybody would experience that. But I went from a socialite to someone who just really, ever since I've worked in these places, is I spend a lot of time alone in my room. Sometimes I can't go out because I'll have certain triggers. I'll see, people eating food, and I'll instantly think of animals, especially if they're eating animals. Billboards, garbage bags, trucks with these fancy labels on them, all these things. So it's a constant reel that goes on in my head. And yeah, so my mood and the person who I was, I think, probably left the first time I walked into a slaughterhouse for sure.
Yeah, and you would say that the people who work there, would you say they share that kind of like you could see in the way they were behaving that working at the slaughterhouse was sending them into this horrible traumatized state, and that seems to be what people say when they come out of it. Like, did you see that in real time?
Yeah, it is that, right? Like I mentioned earlier, it's like people are just walking in
Yeah.
sort of mindlessly, and it's yeah, it's very sad to see, because often these people are coming from places, foreign countries.
Hmm.
They're often marginalized, and don't have the educational or language skills. So they're the ones that are being put into these jobs. It's not as if we have children saying, "Mom, Dad, you know what I want to do when I grow up? I want to be a slaughterhouse worker." 'Cause we would seek therapy for them, right? We
Yeah.
would honestly be looking into that, but we're putting these vulnerable people into these positions where they feel like they have no choice. And for sure, it translates. Like you just feel the energy. You say hi to somebody, and you sometimes you don't even get a high back. It's just very low. And yeah, there's a common misconception about the workers as well. They aren't these big brilly type people.
Mm.
Maybe some of them are,
Hmm.
but the vast majority of people I worked on these high speed lines were women, and they had multiple injuries. If you can imagine the sound, your eyesight, because you're looking at line speeds that are going so fast, and then working with dangerous equipment, amputees, carpal tunnel surgeries, shoulders, all these things. So it's a very low energy vibration for sure.
Well, this is the problem with these slaughterhouses, because they're going at such a speed, and people want to talk constantly. Like, I don't personally know a good way to kill somebody, but they want to talk about killing these animals in a humane way, and it's like, well, even if this were to be the case at that speed, like, did you see like animals being killed in a way that wasn't actually the way they were supposed to be killed? Like, did you see that often?
Yeah, and so like when you look at the government way of controlling and seeing how things are supposed to be done, of course I did. Of course you
Mm.
saw, chickens missing a line where their neck's supposed to be cut after they were electrocuted. They
Mm.
come to and they go into a skull tank. When you hear pigs, regardless of like if a gas chamber is working or not, you hear their screams. It haunts you.
Mm.
And you can hear it from outside,
Yeah.
even if you can imagine what that would sound like inside.
Yeah.
They're screaming for their lives. So absolutely, it's 100% quite awful of an experience for sure.
Yeah. Well, you talked about people walking around mindlessly in these slaughterhouses. I'm wondering, it sounds a lot like detachment. Like, did you feel
Mm.
like you had to detach yourself from the process of slaughtering animals, of witnessing animals being slaughtered, in order to just carry on doing it? Did you feel like kind of like dissociative?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think you can't not detach yourself, but I think it's like intuitively, so for myself, for example, when I the first time, like I will never forget that. I walk in, the smell and the heat hits your face, feathers, dust everywhere, and I see, this bird whose head's frozen to a crate, and I can't unsee that. That's stuck with me for the rest of my life, and of course, like because my grandfather helped me get the job, my uncle's an inspector there, my mom, aunt, grandma, they all worked in it. So I'm next in line, so to say. And of course I had to detach myself from an innocent being going through such a horrific act. I think it's just a protectionist thing. It's somehow that's a flight or fight sort of mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
And so of course, yeah, all workers would have to. And I don't think like hindsight's 2020, obviously, and I don't think I even realized some of these things. And we didn't have therapy then. We didn't have people checking in with us to say, "Hey, are you okay?" And I believe that's probably still the case now, which is horrifying if you think about these workers going into this place knowing they can't talk to anybody. So they're just going to have to either double down on what they're doing, or they're going to have to, uh, you know, live with the consequences of their action and just stay silent. So it's pretty awful. And like I'm fortunate that I've been able to seek therapy. I've been diagnosed with some things.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously trauma related, all related to that. And I think like it's a side that people aren't really aware of. And hopefully, with conversations like this, people will be a little bit more aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were talking about like the chicken being frozen and stuck to the crate. Because I was going to ask, like, is there any particular memory of like an animal who sticks out to you? Like, because obviously you have these things repeating in your mind, seeing all these things. Are there any other examples of that?
Yeah, there's like I said, a constant reel going on in my head. So if I see a garbage bag, it's the time that I had to collect multiple birds, and there was a time where 26,000 birds or 24,000 birds had died due to heat exhaustion, heart attacks. 5 weeks old, and there's humans stepping on these birds to try to see who's alive, and they're just everywhere. It was awful. It's horrifying, and yeah, just having to see the necropsy happen, having to see these birds come in with bruises and broken wings, and they can't. They're not very loud. They can't really express how much pain they're in. So with cows, like the first time I went in, the first cow I saw get slaughtered was, flailing and freaking out, and that wasn't just one, it was another, and baby cows getting cut out of cows, and
Wow.
there's just a constant reel that goes on. I have to do grounding techniques for myself. I have to obviously another good thing for me is to speak about it. So
Yeah.
with that is it's tough sometimes, right? Because I have to um I want to change hearts and minds, but I have to see how graphic I can be without triggering myself, without triggering somebody else. It's a fine line, and yeah,
It must be extra frustrating because we see time and time again people deny things that we've seen recorded, like animal rights activists have gone to farms and seen, and but for you've actually been like a step closer. And yeah, that must be so much more frustrating for you when you hear people insist that this is done in a nice way, and yeah, I like it makes
yeah,
it more commendable that you do what you do, despite that having that effect on you, because it is horrible when people are just not, they're not telling the truth, or maybe they're not meaning to, or they're in denial, but then you take the brunt of it. And we spoke before about the people you worked with being quite clearly probably traumatized. Do you think that someone can really work in a place like this without being traumatized, without having some sort of issue that you know harms them? Do you think that's even possible as a ex-slaughterhouse worker?
I don't see how that can be possible where somebody is so far removed. Maybe if there's some psychopathy, there might be some evidence to suggest that when we lose empathy, and I spoke with people, PhDs, going into this field. When we lose empathy, sometimes we move into psychopathy, and so yeah, I don't think there's I think it's a doubling down effect. Whereas, like, if you admit to like what you've been part of,
Mm-hmm.
then maybe somehow you're a bad person or a monster, even, or there's some things about you that aren't right, and so people have to wage that, especially if they're getting paid and this is their job. They've been doing it for a while, and yeah, back to what you said, like it's amazing that people will often say these things like, well, you don't know what happens. We treat our animals good. You don't. Oh, you city folks or you people just don't know. And
Mm-hmm.
it is frustrating. I'm trying to look at it as an opportunity
Yeah.
to have a wild card in that situation. So if someone will say something like, well, you don't know, I can very easily back that up and say, well, what do you think is the best way to do this? Or if do we need to do it? Is it necessary? And then I can go into like using the wild card, and I can validate the community. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's probably the biggest thing I can bring to the community is to say, look, you don't even need to have worked in this place or seen what's happened in these places. It's pretty evident, and common sense will get you there. But if I have to, I'll weigh in and I can help in that sense.
Yeah,
So.
it's so invaluable to have somebody who, not only to show that people can change, because I was going to ask, like, you've gone from a massive transition between a slaughterhouse worker to an animal rights activist who's so dedicated. Like, you do animal rights activism every day. Your dedication now has to have been influenced by the fact that you worked in slaughterhouses for like 15 years. Would you say that drives you like more than anything?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just setting foot that first day that I walked in, I think that would just be enough for me to fuel me for my entire life. So obviously seeing what I did for a number of years, I think it was like 6 to 8 years I worked in slaughterhouses, and then I worked in animal health, so there's overlap there. And yeah, so obviously like it's given me an ability to speak about my experience and an ability to stand up for beings that just really are treated like, just like commodities and not given any right to life. And of course, it's great to have a community to 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 bounce this off of and actually speak out and have a voice. For me, it was initially when I went vegan, I didn't even know there was such a name as vegan. So it's about like 9 or 10 years ago. I tried this thing, and I started eating plant based, and then the more I started to learn about plant-based, then I found out about this thing called veganism. And it took a couple speeches that I saw by inspiring activists, and I just thought I have this story, and like I'm obligated to tell it. And I think if anybody was in my position, I think everybody would be doing as much as I am and putting in as much effort and time, because it's really the only way. It's an obligation.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting as well. It's interesting how, vegans will welcome with open arms people who have been in these situations, like who have then turned around. Like, would you say that when you tell people this story, that they are actually like more like intrigued and open to kind of like elevating your story rather than looking down on you or trying to disperse you from from that community?
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember my first few days deciding whether or not I want to go to a vigil, because I thought I was going to get my ass kicked. I thought, I'll go, but I won't say anything. And so I
Hmm.
didn't say anything the first time I went. And obviously some people have this fear about going to these places to bear witness and whatnot. So I think, like, if somebody who's been to where I have been and seen what I did has the courage to, well, maybe not courage, but the obligation to go out and try these things, I think anybody can do it.
Hmm.
I had so much going against me, culture, society, where I worked, how I grew up, and I think these stories are so powerful. And I've only seen people elevate me and really bring me into the community, which, I had these preconceived notions, just like veganism. I had some preconceived notions when I first started hearing about, speaking up and talking about it. And that's all bogus. It's a
Hmm.
lot easier when you start to frame and put things in perspectives in the victim's perspective. Then that can be your leading force. And yeah, it's been incredible. I haven't had very much backlash, if any. Yeah.
David, thank you so much for coming on and speaking with me and coming onto this platform. And I just want to say, have you got any kind of like closing words to somebody who maybe works in a slaughterhouse, finds it difficult, or detaches themselves and might see this? Like, what would you say to them if you had the opportunity?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what I would say to anybody who's working currently in a slaughterhouse, I ask you to look back at maybe the first time you walked into one of these places and you saw what you saw. Really, maybe concentrate on that moment and dig in deep to see how it made you feel. Obviously, maybe times have changed and maybe you feel a little less connected. But what I would say is there's groups to help. There's Brave New Life Project out in Colorado, who's working on ways to help workers get out of these places. I'm available to help if you want me to help. It's really about what it's doing to you as well. Like, I didn't figure these things out for almost 15, 20 years. And so these things are going to sit with you. If you've noticed you're off-putting to people, if you're isolated, I would definitely seek some therapy as well, just to figure these things out. They're free services almost everywhere. So yeah.
David, thank you so much. And this is the 40-year-old vegan. You can follow him over on Instagram and other platforms. He's doing amazing work every single day. So please show your support.
Thank
And
you, Al. Really appreciate it.